This is a community-supported legal education channel. Find out how you can support our mission at the links in the description below.
Hello everyone, I'm Leonard French, your favorite copyright attorney, and today I've got a remarkable story for you about defamation, or rather, when a person has such a terrible reputation that false statements about them no longer harm their reputation, and they are therefore defamation-proof. So let me introduce today's subject, none other than baseball legend Lenny Dykstra. Here's a photo of him back in 1986. He is now a little bit older. Here's him in 2016. And just because we're going to be speaking about the man, have a little bit of background information. Leonard Kyle Dykstra, born February 10th, 1963, is an American former professional baseball center fielder who played in Major League Baseball for the New York Mets from 85 to 89 and the Philadelphia Phillies from 89 to 96. Dykstra was a three-time All-Star and won a World Series championship as a member of the 1986 Mets. Since retirement, Dykstra has been mired in financial and legal troubles. In 2009, he filed for bankruptcy. In 2011, he was arrested and charged with bankruptcy fraud, followed by grand theft auto and drug possession charges on an unrelated case, as well as indecent exposure. He served 6.5 months in federal prison. So, defamation. You might see why a person might have something written about them, and then in financial troubles, you might see why someone might sue. So without further ado, let's see what he sued over and what the judge had to say about that. This is in the Supreme Court of the state of New York. That is actually the lowest court of the state of New York. That is the entry-level court, whereas the Supreme Court is basically the highest court everywhere else. That's just New York has to be different. It's in New York County in this case. And this is before the Honorable Robert D. Kalish. This is the judge's decision and order, not a complaint, not a pleading or something, but a decision and order. And this is Lenny Dykstra, the plaintiff, who sued St. Martin's Press, Macmillan Publishing, Ronald Darling, a former teammate, I believe, and Daniel Paisner, his ghost writer. Dykstra, a former Major League Baseball player, brings this action for 1. Defamation, and 2. Intentional infliction of emotional distress against his former New York Mets teammate Darling and against publisher defendants based upon allegedly defamatory statements made about him in the undermentioned book. In 2019, Darling and his ghostwriter Paisner through St. Martin's Press published a book entitled 108 Stitches, Loose Threads, Ripping Yarns, and the Darndest Characters from My Time in the Game. The book. The book contains a story regarding an alleged interaction between Dykstra and Boston Red Sox pitcher Dennis Oil Can Boyd during Game 3 of the 1986 World Series. Dykstra and Darling were teammates on the Mets during the series. In the book, Darling provides the following reference about Dykstra, quote, "I only played a few hot minutes with Dennis Oil Can Boyd, the momentarily great Red Sox pitcher who featured significantly in the team's turnaround in the late 1980s. We were teammates on the Montreal Expos for a couple weeks in 1991, but we had a history before that, of course. Dennis was one of those workhorse stars of the Red Sox 1986 pitching staff. He'd won 16 games that year for Boston and was slated to start Game 7 of the World Series against yours truly, before a rainout pushed the game back another day, and left-hander Bruce Hurst, on closer to full rest, was tabbed instead, here again, against yours truly. In Game 3 of the 1986 World Series, though, Oil Can was on the receiving end of the ugliest piece of vitriol I'd ever heard. In a bar, on a baseball diamond, anywhere. It was right up there with one of the worst, most shameful moments I've ever experienced in the game. And one of the great shames of the exchange was that I sat there with my teammates and I didn't do a damn thing about it. In fact, it resulted in a momentum shift that probably turned the series around for us, and like most of the other guys on the bench, I stood and cheered at the positive outcome. Recall, the Mets had dropped the first 2 games at home in that series, a nail-biter and a laugher. Going into Game 3 at Fenway Park on the heels of that lopsided loss at Shea, we were feeling the pressure. I was tempted to write that we were really feeling the pressure, but this team wasn't like that. This team was arrogant, always believed it would win it all, never mind what it said on the scoreboard or in the box score. Still in all, it was a must-win for the good guys, only we didn't exactly come across as the good guys on this. The hero for Game 3 for us was also the a-hole of the game, Lenny Dykstra, one of baseball's all-time thugs. You know how there always seems to be a guy in every organization, in every walk of life, who gets away with murder being a figurative term in this case? That was Lenny. He was a criminal in every sense, although during his playing days his crimes were mostly of an interpersonal nature. He treated people like stuff, walked around like his stuff didn't stink, and he was generally a salty human being. And just maybe the most confident, cocky player I would ever encounter. It was after he left the game, though, that his behavior took a truly criminal turn. He ended up being sentenced to house arrest on a bankruptcy fraud indictment, and he was also up on drug possession and grand theft auto charges, for which he received a 3-year prison sentence. Not exactly the poster boy for America's game, huh? Well, Lenny was leading off for us that night, as he did most nights when he was in the lineup, and as Oil Can was taking his final warm-ups on the mound, Lenny was in the on-deck circle shouting every imaginable and unimaginable insult and expletive in his direction. Foul, racist, hateful, hurtful stuff. I don't want to be too specific here because I don't want to commemorate this dark, low moment in Mets history in that way, but I will say that it was the worst collection of taunts and insults I'd ever heard. Worse, I'm betting, than anything Jackie Robinson might have heard his first couple times around the league. Way worse than the Hollywood version of a opposing player's mistreatment of Jackie that was on display in that Jackie Robinson story. Way worse than whatever Kevin Garnett had famously said to get under Carmelo Anthony's skin the night Melo went looking for KG in the locker room after the Celtics-Knicks game in 2013. And yet, whatever Lenny shouted at Oil Can out there on the mound that night might have had the desired effect because Dennis looked rattled. It's amazing to me looking back that there's no footage from that game revealing Lenny's treachery. He was out here shouting this stream of unconscionable stuff in plain sight, in earshot of anyone in one of the front rows and certainly in range of the cameras and microphones that had been set up to record the game. But I guess the attention was elsewhere. To be clear, bench jockeying has a long and fine tradition in the game, and there's a fine art to it, but there are lines that are not meant to be crossed. Wives and girlfriends are usually off limits, except if a taunt is offered in a benign, non-specific way, as in, tell your wife to stop calling my room. In popular usage, offered by a beer-soaked fan taunting you from the stands. Racial or religious or sexual slurs are typically out of bounds as well. For the most part, the razzing is limited to the target's physical appearance or his skills as a ball player, as in, you can't even run to first base without getting gassed. Or, on an attempted bunt, who's gonna run for you? Or, apropos of pretty much anything, you ain't got stuff today. But this stuff coming out of Lenny's mouth was beyond the pale, unprintable, unmentionable, unforgettable, and like I said, he was landing his punches. First at-bat of the game, Lenny smoked a 1-1 pitch deep down the right field line for a home run, igniting a 4-run rally and setting us up to take back some of the momentum we'd lost in the opening games at Shea. Lenny came back to the dugout and collected the high fives and huzzas that came his way, and for all I know, I was right there with my teammates, thrilled to be back in this thing. It's only in retrospect that I started to feel somewhat complicit, and that by accepting the gifts that fell Lenny's way as a result of his ugly treatment of the opposing pitcher, I was an accomplice of some kind. Dykstra alleges that the references tarnished the New York Mets' 1986 World Series championship by falsely claiming that Dykstra's legendary home run that sparked the Mets' comeback was the result of racist taunts. Dykstra alleges that the reference has forever branded him a racist, and that it was maliciously stated to attack him and his abilities as a professional athlete, person, and ability to earn a living going forward. Dykstra further alleges that the reference subjected him to emotional distress, mental anguish, shame, disgrace, ridicule, loss of standing in the entertainment community, and irreparable harm to his professional reputation. He seeks an unspecified monetary sum to compensate him for loss of opportunities, financial damages, emotional distress, and mental anguish, as well as attorney's fees and punitive damages. Darling moves to dismiss the amended complaint for failure to state a cause of action. The basis of Darling's motion is not whether the statements were defamatory in nature, but rather whether Dykstra's reputation precludes this action. Darling argues that Dykstra is a classic libel-proof plaintiff, whose reputation is so bad that he simply cannot be defamed. Darling argues that the reference is substantially true, and any alleged incremental harm would be nominable and non-actionable. Darling also argues that Dykstra's emotional distress claim is duplicative of his defamation claim. Darling argues that the record shows overwhelming and uncontradictable public record evidence by authors, journalists, and Dykstra himself in an autobiography and in interviews that, prior to the publication of the book, Dykstra's reputation was that of a convicted felon, a liar, a fraud, a drug abuser, a cheat, an extortionist who had publicly bragged in his 2016 autobiography and in interviews that he used steroids and blackmail to enhance his baseball performance. Dykstra has also been repeatedly referred to in public as a violent person and a predator. Dykstra has been publicly referred to for years as a homophobe, a misogynist, and a bigot who is undeniable. Darling argues that Dykstra's reputation for abusive conduct and charged language was well documented before the publication of the book. Dykstra argues that the application of the libel-proof plaintiff doctrine, so libel is written defamation and slander is spoken defamation, and we're just going to call it defamation. It all falls under a category of defamation. But the doctrine here under New York law is called the libel-proof plaintiff doctrine. Dykstra argues against the application of the libel-proof plaintiff doctrine, reasoning that there is no definitive record, something akin to a criminal conviction, sufficient to establish that, as a matter of law, as in, so not just fact, but the court recognizes it as a finding of law as well. As a matter of, well, that's a, you shouldn't say finding of law. There's, finding of fact and conclusion of law. The court should recognize it as a conclusion of law, Leonard. That Dykstra's reputation could suffer no harm as a result of the reference. He argues that his reputation is not as poor as Darling makes it out to be. He argues that even assuming his reputation is as poor as the assertions made by his two former employees make it seem, the reference nonetheless further tarnished his reputation in the following ways. It has delegitimized the 1986 New York Mets World Series championship, sullied his reputation all around the country, exposed Dykstra to public ridicule and disgrace, and resulted in the loss of business opportunities and standing in the entertainment and sports communities. I mean, if it's true, you should suffer those losses, right? On one, in one perspective. In reply, Darling reiterates that Dykstra has a long, detailed, and eminently public reputation for bigotry and unsportsmanlike conduct. Critically, much of this public image was created and actively shaped by Dykstra himself. In many instances, he appears to enthusiastically detail his misbehavior in an effort to create a bad boy image. Dykstra's tarnished reputation is the product of his own public actions and statements. Darling argues that to the extent that the statements at issue here may have suggested to some readers that Mr. Dykstra's Game 3 home run was attributable to his taunting, that is impossible for anyone to know, and clearly a matter of conjecture and non-actionable opinion, and it was articulated as such. Whatever Lenny shouted at Oil Can out there on the mound that night might have had the desired effect, because Dennis looked rattled, said the quote. Further, Darling states that to the extent Dykstra argues that he was harmed by the reference's implications for his reputation with regards to sportsmanlike conduct, this argument should be rejected, as his reputation was already ruined by numerous public record findings and admissions of steroid use and blackmailing umpires. Moreover, Darling asserts that the reference is limited to an anecdote that is clearly described as occurring in 1986 and does not make any representations whatsoever about the present day Lenny Dykstra. Defamation is the making of a false statement that tends to expose the plaintiff to public contempt, ridicule, aversion, or disgrace, or induce an evil opinion of him in the minds of right-thinking persons, and to deprive him of their friendly intercourse in society. An action for defamation seeks to compensate the plaintiff for the injury to his or her reputation caused by defendant's written expression, which is libel, or oral expression, which is slander. To state a claim for defamation, a plaintiff must allege 1. A false statement, that is, 2. Published to a third party, 3. Without privilege or authorization, 4. Constituting fault as judged by, at minimum, a negligence standard, that 5 causes harm unless the statement constitutes defamation per se. or per se means automatically, in which damages are presumed. There are 4 categories of statements that do constitute defamation per se. 1, statements charging plaintiff with a serious crime. 2, statements that tend to injure plaintiff in her trade, business, or profession. 3, statements that plaintiff has a loathsome disease. Or 4, imputing unchastity to a woman. The allegedly defamatory passages must be considered in the context of the entire article and the words taken as they are commonly understood. In seeking to protect free speech interests, courts require that a public figure suing for defamation must plead that the allegedly defamatory statements were made with actual malice. Actual malice means that the statement was made knowing its falsity or with reckless disregard for the truth. Reckless disregard for the truth has been interpreted to mean a high degree of awareness of probable falsity. Accordingly, actual malice cannot be established merely because reliance on a source's information is negligent. The mere failure to conduct further investigation is insufficient to establish actual malice. The focus of the inquiry is on the subjective state of mind of the defendant. The libel-proof plaintiff doctrine bars relief in a defamation action to a plaintiff whose reputation with respect to a specific subject may be so badly tarnished that he cannot be further injured by allegedly false statements on that subject. The doctrine is not limited to plaintiffs with criminal records. The rationale behind the doctrine is that free speech interests should prevail over the interests of an individual who, due to an already soiled reputation, would not be entitled to recover anything other than nominal damages. Whether a plaintiff is libel-proof is a question of law for a court to decide, as opposed to a question of fact for a jury to find. The substantial truth defense dismisses a libel claim because a statement is not false and therefore an element of the cause of action has not been met. A statement is substantially true if the statement would not have a different effect on the mind of the reader from that which the pleaded truth would have produced. Since Dykstra has conceded that he is a public figure, he must set forth sufficient factual allegations to support that the reference was published with actual malice. The amended complaint alleges that St. Martin's Press and Macmillan Group knew that 1. Any comparison to the racist threats that were made against Jackie Robinson would be false due to the alarming nature of the remarks against Jackie Robinson, and 2. Darling had previously published another book entitled Game 7, in which he discussed Game 3 of the 1986 World Series against Boston Red Sox that is the subject of the reference in this action, yet without any mention of any of the subject statements. And 3, there was no video evidence of these statements. These allegations alone are insufficient to constitute actual malice. Failure to investigate before publishing, even when a reasonably prudent person would have done so, is not sufficient to establish reckless disregard. Dykstra argues that publisher defendants purposely avoided the truth because, as the reference acknowledges, it's amazing to me, looking back, that there's no footage from the game revealing Lenny's treachery. However, the mere fact that there is no footage documenting the alleged treachery does not mean that the publisher defendants acted with actual malice in publishing the reference. To the contrary, the reference goes out of its way to acknowledge this discrepancy and offers an explanation for it, that the attention of the cameras and the crowd might have been focused elsewhere. By doing so, the reference allows the reader to take this discrepancy into account when determining whether to believe Darling or Dykstra. Furthermore, even if Dykstra's treachery was captured by some cameras, FCC regulations and societal taboos could explain why it was not part of the broadcast. Because remember, broadcast standards are much higher, so you can't have stuff like that said on broadcast. That Dykstra already had such a poor reputation for bigoted behavior and unsportsmanlike conduct further militates against a finding that publisher defendants acted with actual malice. A reasonable publisher in the position of publisher defendants would have determined that the reference would cause virtually no further damage to Dykstra's already soiled reputation. Accordingly, publisher defendants' motion to dismiss the first cause of action for defamation as against them, based on Dykstra's failure to plead actual malice, is granted. Darling argues that, assuming there is actual malice on his part, Dykstra is still barred from recovery under the libel-proof plaintiff doctrine. Again, this doctrine is applied only in rare circumstances. This court finds that the case at hand is one of those rare circumstances. Based on the papers submitted on this motion prior to the publication of the book, Dykstra was infamous for being, among other things, racist, misogynist, and anti-gay, as well as a predator, abuser, thief, and embezzler. Further, Dykstra had a reputation, largely due to his autobiography, of being willing to do anything to benefit himself and his team, including using steroids and blackmailing umpires. The court has been presented the aforementioned in exhibits, which include Dykstra's criminal convictions. This court finds then, as a matter of law, the reference in the book has not exposed Dykstra to any further public contempt, ridicule, aversion, or disgrace, or evil opinion of him in the minds of right-thinking persons, or deprivation of friendly intercourse in society. Dykstra is a former baseball player who has admitted to pushing the boundaries of sportsmanship and crossing the line into gamesmanship to gain a physical and psychological advantage. For instance, he bragged about blackmailing umpires. He admitted to revealing umpires' private information out on the field to manipulate them. In one occasion, threatening to out an umpire about being in a gay club the night before. The reference portrays him as just that, an athlete who is using psychological manipulation to his advantage. From a sportsmanship perspective, Dykstra hurling insults at an opposing pitcher to ultimately throw him off his game is hardly as disgraceful as his self-portrayal of abusing steroids or blackmailing umpires. Moreover, in a 2013 book, Dykstra's former magazine editor detailed his account of working with Dykstra and asserted that Dykstra described Willie Mays as his field person, Venus and Serena Williams as animals, and Celtics coach Doc Rivers as a spear chucker. Sorry, those references are uncomfortable to even read. In his book, Frankie tells the story of how Dykstra allegedly said that the staff of the Carlisle Hotel had been offended when Dykstra loudly used the N-word in the lobby, and they had booted him out. In another instance, Frankie tells the story of how Dykstra allegedly refused to put ugly B-words, usually female Asian golfers, in his magazine, stating, "No one wants to see that." Dykstra undisputedly has never brought a libel suit against Coughlin, Frankie, or other media outlets for such reporting. Further, Dykstra, in his previous book, in 2017, recounted the same game, Game 3, and detailed how he hurled at Boyd unprintable insults consisting of hateful, hurtful declarations and unsuitable comments. Darling, in his 2017 book, wrote the following, an earlier reference. Quote, Lenny was batting in the leadoff spot. He took up position in the on-deck circle as Oil Can Boyd completed his warm-ups, and the things Lenny was screaming towards the pitcher's mound were pretty much unprintable. He dropped every hateful, hurtful declaration that he thought was suitable to the moment, along with a whole bunch of unsuitable comments. You have to realize, in an old ballpark like Fenway, the distance between the on-deck circle and the pitcher's mound is nothing. Lenny was practically on top of the pitcher, which made his tirade all the more remarkable. He was relentless, fearless, tasteless, running his mouth every which way. I'd never seen anything like it. Really, it was remarkable. One of the themes of his venomous chatter was that this was going to be a bad, bad day for Boyd, that Lenny was going to take him deep, that we were about to put a hurt on these Red Sox like you wouldn't believe. He was taunting him mercilessly, and what was so interesting to me here was that we were up against it. We'd given away our home field advantage, down 2-0 in the series. So by rights, we should have dialed down the swagger and taken more of an underdog approach, but to a man, our guys would have told you it was still our series to win. Lenny was just giving a voice to what we were all thinking, loudly, crassly. It was hubris of the highest order, and yet it was so typical of Lenny, and typical of the 1986 New York Mets. Even down 2-0 in the series, we put it out there that we had the Red Sox exactly where we wanted them, that we would dictate these next games. And do you know what? We did. Absolutely. We did, and I have to think in a lot of ways the series turned on the back of Lenny's vitriol before the first pitch was thrown at Fenway. It had to rattle Boyd hearing Lenny run his mouth like that, and forget Boyd, I'm sure it pissed off the entire Red Sox bench. But Lenny did more than just talk, he also delivered. He stepped to that plate and drove a 1-1 pitch down the right field line for a leadoff home run, so before the game was even underway, we had our edge. That's the thing about Lenny Dykstra, he always delivered. Forget the troubles that would find him away from the field when his playing days were over. In his time, in his way, he was one of the most dynamic, most unique unique spark plugs to ever play the game, and I used to sit back and watch him and think how lucky we were to have him on our side. Other than the book referring to the rant as racist and comparing it to attacks that Jackie Robinson had endured, the book's reference is eerily similar to the earlier reference from 2017. Neither lists the insults, but both describe them as too offensive to be shown in print. In addition, Dykstra's disreputability extends beyond the field. Reportedly, he has been the subject of at least 24 legal actions, including 18 within a year, for non-payment and breach of contract. In one instance, it was reported that he asked his former driver, Paul Lee, to rough up and hurt his former pilot and shut him up about his non-payments. Separately, Dykstra has reportedly made discriminatory comments against an employee who was gay. Frankie, in his book, explains an anecdote where, in a video posted on YouTube promoting Dykstra's new reality television show, Dykstra was shown interviewing a male employee. During the interview, Dykstra asked, "You like men or women?" The interviewee said he preferred men. Dykstra said, "I like women. I'm a normal dude. I know for a fact nobody chooses to wake up next to another guy's hairy butt." Relatedly, Dykstra has built his reputation as a misogynist. In his book, Frankie asserts that Dykstra wanted to list fellatio as one of his job requirements for his female employees. Further, in 2012, Dykstra pleaded no contest to charges of lewd conduct and assault with a deadly weapon relating to an incident with a female employee. In his book, Frankie asserts that in this instance, Dykstra threatened a female employee with a knife to massage his thighs around his private areas, and he was sentenced to 270 days in jail and placed on probation for 3 years. The nature and seriousness of Dykstra's criminal offenses, which include fraud, embezzlement, grand theft, and the aforementioned conduct, and notably the degree of publicity they received, have already established his general bad reputation for fairness and decency, far worse than the allegedly charged bench jockeying in the reference could. Given the aforementioned litany of stories concerning Dykstra's poor and mean-spirited behavior, particularly towards various groups including racial minorities, women, and the LGBTQ community, this court finds that, as a matter of law, this reference cannot induce an evil opinion of Dykstra in the minds of right-thinking persons, or deprive him of his friendly intercourse in society, as that evil opinion has long existed. In reaching this conclusion, this court balances Dykstra's reputational interest against society's interest in promoting free expression, while keeping in mind that New York provides some of the strongest protections for the latter. Moreover, Dykstra has failed to state how he has been damaged other than in a conclusory fashion. As Darling argues, Dykstra asks this court to entertain a fishing expedition to see if there is anyone who thinks less of Dykstra because of the reference. This court finds that Dykstra's inability to point to any monetary losses further militates in favor of having his dispute with Darling litigated in the court of public opinion, rather than an actual taxpayer-funded court of law. Indeed, as the United States Supreme Court has explained, the first remedy of any victim of defamation is self-help, using available opportunities to contradict the lie or correct the error and thereby to minimize its adverse impact on reputation. Public officials and public figures usually enjoy significantly greater access to the channels of effective communication and hence have a more realistic opportunity to counteract the false statements than private individuals normally enjoy. Private individuals are therefore more vulnerable to injury, and the state interest in protecting them is correspondingly greater. Given Dykstra's celebrity and apparent attraction to the spotlight, Dykstra's remedy lies in telling his own story to the public. In fact, according to the motion papers, Dykstra has already enlisted the likes of baseball greats Dwight "Doc" Gooden and Darryl Strawberry, and even Dennis Oilcan Boyd, to dispute Darling's story. And this court takes notice of the considerable attention that this dispute has garnered in sports and entertainment media. See the Guccione case, characterizing the underlying dispute between Guccione and Hustler publisher Larry Flynt as an ongoing grudge match. As such, this court sees no legal basis for why it should use its very limited time and resources litigating whether Dykstra engaged in yet another example of bigoted behavior over 30 years ago in a court of law. There are sports commentators, bloggers, and legions of baseball fans to litigate this issue in a public space. This court, however, has cases involving lost livelihoods, damaged and lost lives, as well as plaintiffs that have suffered very real reputational injuries. Accordingly, Darling and publisher defendants' motions to dismiss the first cause of action for defamation, pursuant to the libel-proof plaintiff doctrine, are granted. Dykstra's second cause of action, for intentional infliction of emotional distress against defendants, is duplicative, as the underlying actions fall within the ambit of Dykstra's defamation cause of action. Moreover, Darling and publisher defendants' alleged conduct is not outrageous, which is required for intentional infliction of emotional distress, by any stretch of the imagination. Accordingly, it is hereby ordered that the motion by defendant Ronald Darling Jr. to dismiss is granted, and the motion by defendants St. Martin's Press, Macmillan Publishing Group, and Daniel Paisner is granted. Costs and disbursements to Darling and publisher defendants taxed by the clerk, and foregoing constitutes the decision of the court, and that is Robert David Kalish, Justice of the Supreme Court of the state of New York. So there you go, a really remarkable decision going over the libel-proof plaintiff doctrine, which just means that Lenny Dykstra is not defamable on these grounds. His reputation is already so low that even a false statement wouldn't make his reputation any lower. Therefore, there's no damage. Therefore, there's no defamation, because defamation is not only the false statement, but it has to cause actual damage. And so if there's no harm to the reputation, there can be no actual damage. So yeah, so it turns out that he's been kind of awful. I mean, I guess it's a matter of opinion, but he really has been kind of awful. He basically lost his money and businesses and declared bankruptcy. Not awful. That's fine. That happens to people. Happens to medical debts from medical. Happens to debts from credit cards. Sometimes, people live outside their means. Other times, something happens and puts them into bankruptcy. So, not awful that Lenny Dykstra had to declare bankruptcy, but apparently he lied and sold off. He lied about his assets, and he sold off assets prior to being allowed to. Basically, when you declare bankruptcy, you can't just go and sell off your assets. Even before bankruptcy, you can't just go and sell off your assets, keep the money, and then declare bankruptcy. You're only allowed to do certain things. You should work that out with your bankruptcy attorney. And you're only allowed to keep a certain amount of money through the bankruptcy. A home up to a certain amount, value of a car up to a certain amount, tools up to a certain amount. You're allowed to have certain expenses and things, and all that's normal. And what Lenny Dykstra was doing was keeping more money than he was allowed to. I believe several $100,000 is what he tried to keep, even though he was. He hid, sold, or destroyed more than $400,000 worth of items from the $18 million mansion, including a $50,000 sink. And those were not part of his bankruptcy disclosures. And so if it's not part of your bankruptcy disclosures, then that's bankruptcy fraud. And so that, along with all of the other things that we read about in that case, yeah, he was a pretty terrible person there. And I don't know that you really could cause any further damage to his reputation. I guess maybe you could say he did something new. So if you said that he did something recently or today and that was false, and so that's going to really hurt the guy's ability to make himself a better person and move on, yeah, that's probably closer to a defamation claim, and maybe not something that involves the libel-proof plaintiff doctrine. But yeah, let us know what you think of Lenny Dykstra and his reputation and defamation, and someone being so terrible or having such a terrible reputation that they cannot be harmed by false statements surrounding that reputation. So that's our show, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm Leonard French, your favorite copyright attorney, and this is Lawful Masses, your favorite community-supported legal news and education channel. Community-supported means we need your financial support on a monthly basis on patreon.com/ljfrench and sponsors.com/law. We also have Floatplane and YouTube memberships. In the month of June, thank you very much to the following $50 plus supporters: Joe Tyson, Wes Delj, Citizen of the Sovereign, John Steele, Beal, Gavin Barnard, Eevi, Kyle Mudrak, Spirit Bear, Jan Negrey, Michael Pearce, Daniel Perez, Blackleaf, Benjamin Hitov, Stephen, Ottah, Cute Grills in Your Area, Longreach Jones, Definitely Not Prenda Law, Ugly Grill, Shielo T, Josh Baker, Gregory, Rudolph Bescherer Jr., Kristian Hellman, Jay Dixon, Ameknight, and Oscar the Phrophet. And thank you to the $5 plus supporters who are scrolling on the LED panel behind me. All of you will be crawling on the screen in front of me and in the description below. I am Leonard French, your favorite copyright attorney. I love you all. I will see you in the videos that drop. Hope you're doing well. Bye.
Of course, you're going to take your ball, even though there's 4 of them laying here. How about you? What do you want? You gonna throw it? What a nice girl. Oh, have you left? Yep, you left the ball. He left the ball, and then this one had to take it. I got the ball. I got the other ball that was in between your legs. That wasn't a euphemism, it really was. Good girl. Hello, boy. Alright, let's go see what we can figure out about the e-bike lock.